Hello everyone and welcome to the final game, which is game 5 of the first day of the Opera Euro Rapid Tournament. It's Linear Dominguez versus Magnus Carlsen, and Dominguez so far hasn't won a game, but he did get 2 draws, and Magnus is still on a killing spree. He lost the first game to Wesley So, and then he won 3 games, and this is game 5. So let's see what happens here, as this is a really crazy game, so hope you guys enjoy it. Let's check it out. Dominguez with the white pieces opens with e4. We have c5, Magnus goes for his Sicilian as he usually does, knight to f3, d6, and now d4. So a nice open Sicilian, we have captures, and the knight to f6. We have knight to c3, and now Magnus does not go for the knight off, but rather he goes g6. He goes for the dragon variation of the Sicilian, which is extremely sharp. So here, bishop to e3, going after some normal development with moves like f3, g4, h4, h5, and so on. Everything you play against the dragon, queen d2, castle, queenside, king b1, and so on. So bishop to g7, and now f3. We have a6 by Magnus. This is not an extremely rare move, but it is somewhat rare. Knight to c6 is usually played here, or castles even more. But okay, Magnus goes for a6, and now queen to d2. You always want to have this setup going after that dark square bishop. So h5, and now he develops the bishop to c4. So bishop to c4, and now knight b to d7. So this has all been seen before, and interestingly, last year, Alexander Grischuk had this position against Magnus Carlsen in the St. Louis Rapid Tournament, and Grischuk won this by playing bishop to b3 here. It was a pretty fun game. I think we actually showed it, but here, instead of bishop to b3, we have queenside castles by Dominguez, and now Magnus just continues developing on the queen side. We have b5, bishop to b3, and now there are some games where bishop to b7 and knight to e5 were played, but here we have knight to c5, and it is as of move 11 that we have a completely new game. So let's see what happens here. King to b1, a nice prophylactic move by Dominguez, and now bishop to b7. So just putting pieces on optimal squares. The rook is coming to c8 and so on. Rook h to e1, and now rook to c8 by Magnus. And here you have to figure out how to continue mounting the pressure. Do you want to play something like a3, h3, maybe knight to d5, or as was played in the game, Dominguez goes for bishop to g5. So it's putting a lot of pressure on the position as e5 is coming, and you want to put some pressure towards that e7 pawn. So here Magnus castled, and now comes knight to d5. So offering some traits here, and capturing doesn't really do anything, because like we said, there's going to be a lot of weak pawns here, specifically the e7 one. For example, if bishop captures, attacks the bishop, and let's say you capture now, there's a problem of this pawn hanging, and you can't really do anything to defend that. If you go rook e8, knight c6, attacks the queen and triples the attack on the pawn, this is going to be a terrible game for black. So instead, after knight d5, Magnus kicks away the knight with e6. We have knight captures with check, bishop captures, and now first h4. The idea is Dominguez wants Magnus to capture so he can play g4 and bust open Carlsen's king side. So Magnus says, sure, no problem. Bishop captures, we have h captures, and king to g7. As Magnus is expecting the h file to open up, he wants to have this possibility of playing rook to h8. And here, while you could play g4, here it would be maybe a bit too soon, because after h captures on g4 and rook to h1, you can easily play rook to h8. So opening up the h file right now doesn't really do all that much. Here you could trade everything, captures, and even go knight captures on e6 with check, but even though I think Dominguez definitely checked this, it doesn't yield more than a draw for him. For example, knight captures, bishop captures on e6, f captures, and now queen captures on d6. Black is up a piece, but that black king is, well, looking terrible there. So maybe Dominguez considered this, maybe not, but it will be hard to win this. So instead, he played queen to e3, and now queen to c7 by Magnus. At some point, you want to eliminate this bishop, and you will have some threats here on the c2 pawn. For the moment, it is very nicely defended by the bishop and the knight. So rook to d2, Dominguez adds another defender to the c2 pawn, and now b4 by Magnus. We have rook e to d1, doubles up rooks on the d file, and now comes rook f to d8, so defending that pawn. We have queen to f4 by Magnus with ideas of queen to f6 by Dominguez with ideas of queen to f6 check, and Magnus defends with queen to e7. And now we have knight to e2, and this is already a very interesting position because Magnus most definitely has to play e5 here. He cannot allow white to play e5, and after you push back the queen, for example queen e3, then you continue with a5, kind of try and trap the bishop with a4 and so on, and black's position will be amazing here. However, Magnus played a5 right away, and now Dominguez seizes the opportunity and pushes e5, and now there's a problem. There's always this queen to f6 check, and that white pawn on f6 will be simply amazing. So Magnus doesn't want to open lines. He plays d5, and now comes g4. This was actually a very, very sneaky position as well, because here a4 is coming, and this could trap your bishop. But there was bishop to c4 in the position where you're just preparing to shift the bishop to d3 basically here. The problem is the bishop cannot be captured. If you capture the bishop, then you have this very annoying rook captures, and queen f6 check. And then white just wins. Queen captures, you're gonna capture back with check, king h7, and rook captures on d8. You're up the exchange in a better position. Black's pieces are terrible here. It would be an easy win. Of course, it's not a forced line, but bishop to c4 definitely the way to go here. However, Dominguez goes for g4. He wants to attack on the king side now. H captures on g4, and now he goes for queen to f6 with check. Magnus has to trade, otherwise just queen captures, or you could even blunder. If you defend the queen, then just queen to h8 is checkmate. So Magnus has to trade here. We have queen captures on f6, and now g captures on f6. This comes with check, and here king to h6. And the problem is this is an incredibly tricky position where white is actually completely winning, but it's not an easy move to find. So both of them missed it during the game, but you're enjoying yourselves at your homes. So feel free to pause the video and try to find the winning move for Dominguez here while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on finding the only and, might I say, extremely difficult move that wins in this position. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, no, it's not that. It's rook to d4. Rook to d4 with the idea that after rook to h1 check comes king goes to g5, then rook captures on g4 is game over. But it's easier said than done because figuring out this move is just crazy. For example, if you capture on f3, threaten the knight, then you still go rook to g4. You simply prevent the king from reaching the square, and the king cannot go back to f6. And now there's not much you can do. Whatever you do, you're getting checkmated, so let's just checkmate the black king right away. And if you don't do something like this after rook to d4, you might play something like g5 to free the g6 square for your king. Doesn't really do you all that much. Rook captures on g4, and now just rook h1 check is coming. You can double up on the g file, for example king g6, just rook d to g1 now, and there isn't anything you can do here. If rook to h8, you're just going to capture on g5 with check, king h6, and now rook somewhere, let's say rook to g3, and then you will deliver checkmate with rook to h1 or rook to h3. Doesn't really matter. But yeah, after this king to h6 move, rook to d4 was deadly. However, both of them missed it, and rook to h1 check was played right away. And although it seems like it's the same idea, why not just play rook to d4 on the next move? It doesn't work. Magnus plays king to g5, and here we have f4 with check. If you go rook to d4 now, just g captures on f3, and there's no good move here for you to play. You're no longer threatening rook to g4, and if you deliver king to g1, king to f5 is coming, and then king captures here, everything falls apart for white. So instead, Dominguez played f4 with check. He forced the king to f5, only move for Magnus, and now rook to f1, defending the pawn and threatening some very nasty knight to g3 checkmate. So Magnus has to make some room for the king, and he plays g5. g3 was also possible, but it looks too dangerous. So here, knight to d4 with check, and now king to g6. King to e4 is actually even stronger for Magnus, and it is in fact winning. Looks super scary, but there's nothing white can do here, because if you move this, then this falls. If you move this rook, then this falls, and then everything falls. And other than that, there's just not all that much for you to do. So instead, king to g6 was played by Magnus, and now comes f5 with check, busting open the f file. E captures, and now knight captures on f5, again with the terrible threat of knight to e7. For example, if black isn't careful, if you play something like rook to h8, just knight e7 check, and where can the black king go to? Only to the h file, and wherever you go along the h file, it's just going to be a nice checkmate, because the pawn covers this square and the knight covers these squares, and it's check, so of course it's checkmate. So Magnus really hanging on by a thread here. Magnus finds the only move that doesn't lose, and that's g3. He has to make some room for his king. So after king to h5, he can access the g4 square. And now knight to e7 check isn't all that impressive, because king h5. And even if you capture the rook, it doesn't really do anything. Knight captures on b3, threatens to pick up the rook with check. So a captures, rook captures, and we get to this endgame where Magnus is down the exchange, but he has a pretty impressive pawn on g3. So not really something you can easily dispose of. So instead, after this g3, we have rook to g2 by Dominguez, going after the pawn now, while the knight is nicely defended. He wants to bust open here on the g file, but now knight to e4 by Magnus, guarding the pawn. So knight captures on g3, grabbing the pawn now, and now rook to e8. Again, the absolute best move. You have to get rid of these pawns, as these pawns are just too strong. So here, knight captures, we have d captures on e4, and now even e6. Here, Dominguez creates a beautiful passed f pawn, f captures, and now f7, threatening Carlsen's rook, rook to e8, and now bishop captures on e6. So what do you do here? Rook to c5. Magnus adds another defender to the g5 pawn, and he says, I'm slowly going to play this rook over here and start pushing my own passed pawn. And there's really no good way for you to continue mounting pressure, because my pawn is on a dark square. Even though you can double rooks here, my king and rook will defend it nicely, and you don't have a dark square bishop. You have a light square bishop, so you're not breaking through here. So here, rook to g3, and now rook to e5, preparing to push that pawn. And here comes bishop to g4. And here, Dominguez was under a lot of time pressure for a lot of moves here. It's already move 41, but Dominguez is constantly under 10 seconds playing an increment, whereas Magnus has some 2.5 minutes. So here, bishop to g4, and now comes e3. Magnus starts pushing his passed pawn. King to c1. Dominguez starts bringing the king into the game, and now finally rook captures on f7. Rook captures, king captures, and now king to d1. The king will try and help out with the blockade. We have king to f6, and now king to e1. We have bishop to d5. Magnus goes after the a2 pawn here, and now a3. We have captures, and now bishop to e4, going after the c2 pawn, but allowing this rook captures on e3. And here Magnus says, I'm very comfortable playing this endgame with the bishops of the same color, being only up one pawn. So here, rook captures on e3. We have bishop captures on c2, and now king to d2. Magnus trades here, captures, and now we enter this endgame, and you can see how the players play this. King to e5, Magnus improves the position of the king, bishop to f3. So you want to cut off the king from reaching that pawn on the queen side, and it's not going to be all that easy, because the bishop covers these two squares, and also these squares are covered, so not a lot of squares for the black king to use. So here we have bishop to f5. Sorry, I accidentally showed you the squares. The dark square bishop controls. The light square bishop controls these squares. The king covers this, and it's not easy for the black king to reach that a3 pawn. So here, bishop back to f5, and now bishop to c6. We have king to d6, going after the pawn here, and now bishop back to f3, saying that you will not have a lot of fun approaching that pawn. King to c5, and now bishop to e2, again creating a wall against the black king, so the black king cannot approach this pawn. Here we have bishop to g6, and now bishop to f1, just playing a waiting game, checking to see what Magnus will do. Bishop to h5, and now king to e4. We have bishop to d1, and now comes king to e3. We have g4 by Magnus, and now bishop to a6. So just keeping the black king away from these squares, but now comes bishop to f3. So bishop back to f1, and now bishop to c6. So we will try to counter this bishop like this. But we have king to f4 going after the pawn, and now here Magnus played something very interesting. Magnus played king to d4 here. He could have gone for bishop to b5, which kinda I think was the plan all along, and if bishop moves, then we go bishop to d7, defend the pawn, and then we try to go over to this pawn. If bishop to f1, then king to d4. So it kinda gets us closer and closer to this pawn without actually giving up this pawn. But Magnus decided that it's not a problem, we can just give up this pawn. He played king to d4, king captures on g4, and now king to c3. We have king to f5, now king to b2. And here we have king to e5, going after, closer to the queen side. And interestingly, the engines give king to e5 as the losing move, whereas they give king to f4 as not a losing move. But this is something too deep to understand. You'd have to really go over this. So if any of you can figure out why this is not losing and why this is losing, do share in the comments, and I'm gonna pin it for everyone to see. So here king to e5, and now king captures on a3. Now the position is very dangerous. King to d6, and now bishop to e8. So now the passed pawn just needs to be promoted, and all that Magnus has to take care of is that this bishop does not sacrifice itself for the pawn when it touches the light square. If he can do that, then it's a win. If not, then it's a draw due to insufficient material. So here king to c5, and now a4. Very dangerous because, if the bishop somehow gets a hold of this pawn, it's all over, but it will require a few more moves. Bishop to c4, we have king to b2. We have king to b4 going after the pawn, a3 now. And now, of course, you cannot reach the a2 square, but Magnus has a plan. He needs to shift this bishop all the way here, and then kick away this bishop, and then somehow get this pawn to the a2 square without the light square bishop covering it. So bishop d5, we have bishop to g6. Bishop to e6, white has nothing to do. White simply has to wait. Bishop to b1. We have bishop to d5, now comes bishop to a2, bishop to e4, and now bishop to f7. So now a2 is being threatened. If a2 comes, then a1 wins the game. So bishop to bishop to b1, saying that, okay, what do you play here? If you push the pawn, I'm just gonna capture it. And of course, if you capture this, then we're gonna capture on a3, and then again it's a draw by insufficient material. So here, feel free to pause the video and try to find the quickest winning idea for Magnus while I give you a couple of seconds. For those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on finding the absolute quickest way to win. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's bishop to b3. And with the bishop on b3, bishop to c2 is coming, then you trap the light square bishop, and then it's just game over. So it was in this position on move 72 that Linear Dominguez resigned the game, and Magnus continues his killing spree. This is his 4th win in a row after losing the first game to Wesley. So really impressive streak, and after the first day, it's Magnus who is leading the tournament, but we're not going to check out the standings. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to show some other games, as today we've only covered Magnus, so we're going to check out on some other games. So don't forget to use #suggestion to help me look for the absolute best of games. So here we resign because whatever you do, you simply either lose the bishop now after bishop to c2 is played, and then the pawn promotes, or you move the bishop, doesn't really matter where. Now a2, and then a1 promotes to a queen and wins the game. After bishop to b3, Dominguez resigned, and an excellent victory for Magnus Carlsen. That's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Sorry about so many uploads today, but this is rapid chess, so we need to cover plenty of games. I would like to thank the Wall Street Cat, Steven Giovanni, William Rideout, Eva Schatz, and Dan Meller for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of this wonderful tournament, checking up on your wonderful suggestions, and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.